Today I'm going to talk to a gentleman who has a fascinating story to tell. Amongst his past occupations, he can list Army Intelligence Officer, an International Private Eye, a gold mine security coordinator, a paramilitary prison officer, and also an arms dealer. As if that wasn't enough, he was also threatened with a lifetime prison sentence for waging war against the Indian state. Well, hello, Peter.
Hi, welcome to Scarborough. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Now, when you left school, you decided to follow in your father's footsteps. Did this go the way that you expected it to?
I'm not sure that any of our lives actually go the way we expect them to, do they? It'd be a pretty boring life if they did. I mean, the short answer, of course, is no. And the influence for me had always been from the military aspects of things, so I had a natural inclination to join the forces, which I did.
Now, you eventually left the army and you found yourself in Zimbabwe. So would you like to tell us a little about what happened and what that led to?
Yes, and harking back to your previous question, you asked me if my career went the way I expected it would when I joined the army, and we talked about that. And one of the fundamental things, changes in my life occurred whilst I was in the army. For the first time, I was part of that group of soldiers who spent almost their entire career in Northern Ireland. I didn't go to places like Hong Kong and what have you, pastures new. And I remember one night watching television, and it was news at 10. I specifically remember it, and the newscast who was doing it is still around today. I forget his name. And he was standing astride a railway line that the then Rhodesian government had built to connect Rhodesia to South Africa. This must have been somewhere in the region, about 1972 or 73 or something like that. And it was a thing called the Beitbridge Rail Link. And of course, in those days, the country we know today as Zimbabwe was a rebellious country. It was called Rhodesia. And it had refused to accept majority rule imposed by the British government and declared unilateral independence. And I mean, all this sort of went over my head. I was a young man in my 20s. I had no idea what UDI was. All I could see was on the television the sun was shining, and in Britain it was pouring with rain, and there were candles in shop windows and not a light in sight. And I'll never forget this newscaster standing astride the railway line saying that the Rhodesian government had built this line ahead of schedule and under budget. And this was in the context of Britain, where we couldn't do anything in those days. This is when we got our reputation as the sick man of Europe. And I thought, that sounds pretty good. And the upshot of that was I went to Zimbabwe. I travelled out there. I thought, this looks like a good life, sunshine, hard work and all the rest of it, and a better standard of living. And so I set off, and I went there. And again, a twist of fate in my life that I would never have predicted. But I got, in the end, I got headhunted and offered the post of operations director for a security company in Harare, which I took. And we had 600 security guards, we had investigations unit, we did cash handling, cash carrying, much like the big security companies in Britain do today. But, one of the interesting things was that technology was marching on. Africa, in those days, particularly Zimbabwe, was a fabulous place to live. All the cost of your housing, the cost of your fruit and veg, your meat was dirt cheap. If you wanted a television, it was massively expensive. But that all seemed okay because you don't buy a television every month. It's a luxury, So we lived a fantastic life. But more and more, I started to realise that I was falling behind the world because people would have relatives coming over for holidays from the UK, and they'd have little handheld computer games. And I remember the first time I saw Tetris. It was something like science fiction to us people living in Africa. And I rapidly started to realise that things had moved on. And I'd heard that people have desktop computers in Britain and things like that. You see, don't forget, when we were talking about my time in the army, only 10, 15 years or so before, the army had built a whole building to put its computer in Northern Ireland, and now I was hearing stuff about things on desks. So I came back to the UK, and I set up in the security industry by myself as a security consultant and advisor. And a very interesting thing happened then, because I was actually employed to try and track down counterfeit pharmaceuticals. And I needed, it was an extraordinary thing, you can't just travel around the world asking people if they've got any hooky pharmaceuticals, you see. It's a bit suspicious and a little bit dangerous as well. And I needed some way of making myself look plausible when I was trying to buy these counterfeits, you see. And I suddenly thought, well, I know all about South Africa. South Africa still was an apartheid regime, still had sanctions on it, and still was subject to UN prohibitions and stuff like that. I thought, I'll pose as a South African arms dealer, and that way they won't think I'm suspicious when I'm looking for counterfeit pharmaceuticals, because they know that any South African arms dealer has got to be a bit hooky, you see. And I had a couple of friends in South Africa, and I arranged to have a telephone number set up so that I could have an address and a business card. Yeah. And that if anybody phoned up, oh yes, he's out of the country travelling, you know, and we'll put it through. And this worked quite well. You know, I presented myself as an arms dealer who happened to be buying pharmaceuticals as well, you know, and I had a degree of success there. But of course, there's always a little thing that traps you, you see, and the problem was that people started asking me to supply arms and ammunition. Right. And very often perfectly reputable people, like, you know, government agents in places like Cyprus or Greece would say, well, the government's looking for 10,000 metres of camouflage material, good profitable thing. Yeah. And I thought, my God, what do I do about this? So when I was back in the UK, I phoned up some ex-military friends and said, look, I've got a real problem here. You know, people are asking me to supply quotes for military equipment. And I got put in touch with some people who were legitimate arms dealers or defence traders, you know, with the Ministry of Defence. And what used to happen, when anybody made an inquiry with me, I'd pass it on to them. They'd put together a quote, give it to me, and I'd hand it back, you see, and everything, and it all worked quite well. And that went on for a number of years, and it was terribly successful. And I'd made a reasonable amount of money, and I had a sort of decent house up on the North York Moors here. You know, Scarborough has always been my home. No matter where I've travelled around the world, I've always come back to Scarborough. When you look out the window, so you can see why, can't you, really?
Definitely.
And I suddenly thought, well, you know, I'm pushing all these deals through to these guys down in London for these arms supplies, and you know, they're not arms supplies as such, but it's stuff that military people want. You know, armies and navies and air forces, they need toilet paper, they need boots, they need computer printers and stuff like this, and they all have, the one thing they have in common, no matter where they are in the world, is they have the most bureaucratic imaginable procurement processes, and the skill in it is negotiating those processes. Right. You know, that's the key thing. Defence traders very rarely sell guns. Guns last for years. You know, you buy a dozen rifles, 30 years later they're still in good condition. Yeah. But a dozen computer printers, 2 years tops, and you need new ones. And I thought, well, I'm putting all these things through to these people. I know that industry backwards anyway, because, you know, part of my skills with the military was understanding the old-time Soviet military equipment. I thought, well, I'll do that for a living. Instead of just giving it to somebody else, I'll do the deal myself. And that's what I did. And for several years, I happily trotted around the world, flogging bits and pieces to various countries and what have you. And of course, you do that in conjunction with the Ministry of Defence, or at least we did in those days. There was a special department to do that. You didn't just go and sell to any old Tom, Dick or Harry. You know, it was a bit dangerous if you did. And I was living a peaceful life, you know, sort of semi-retired, enjoying the fruits of many years' labour. And then the wheel came off, and I ended up, as you quite rightly said, in a jail cell in Calcutta, which I don't recommend for health. If you're looking for a short break, I'd put Beiderbecke's Hotel over a jail cell in Calcutta every time. Yeah. Did you want me to tell you how that came about?
Yes, certainly.
Like I said to you before, you know, defence trading isn't just selling guns to people for bundles of fivers in brown paper packages in mucky hotel rooms. In reality, it's actually quite a mundane occupation. As the seller, you rarely see what you sell, and you rarely sell arms and ammunition or anything like that, because they're not the sort of things that wear out. You know, what I want to see is somebody's toilet paper order or somebody's computer printer order, because they go through those. Army uniforms are a wonderful thing to sell, because, you know, soldiers, by the nature of their job, have a hard and active life. Uniforms don't last 5 minutes. So if you can land the contract to supply the material for the uniforms,
it's ongoing, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're doing very good business indeed. Sell them a rifle, they don't want another one for 20 years. It's you know, they're good quality bits of kit. And I ended up, 1993, I received an inquiry from some businessmen in Denmark wanting to know if I could give them a quote for the supply of some rifles. It was a pretty routine thing. You know, you do sort of half a dozen of those a week. Maybe 1 in 100 will materialise, because there are so many out there. So I sent off my quote in the normal thing, and then a few weeks later, somebody got in touch with me and said, well, you know, it was good price, good service contract, we'd like to go ahead. Will you come to Copenhagen to sign the deal? I said, yes, of course. You know, so I flew off there, and I drew up the contracts and took those with me, you see, and the port of destination I'd been given was the Calcutta port. And when you say Calcutta port, what you actually mean by that is the customs area in there.
Yeah.
That's a legal definition of the port. You can have a port in London that's at Heathrow Airport, and it's a warehouse. That's the port, but it's owned by customs, you see. And they signed the contracts, and we had a drink. And then the one guy turned to me and said, well, you said how you'll deliver it to Calcutta, but we want it about 600 miles inland. How are you going to get it there? And I thought, God, it's a hooky deal, because no legitimate trader would ever say that to you. You know, in the defence trade, you only sell from customs bonded warehouse to customs bonded warehouse. So I thought, well, that's it. So I came back to England and I telephoned the Ministry of Defence, and I said, look, this is what's happened. Here's the details. Here's the people I contacted, all the rest of it, the details of the goods. This is what they said to me. What do you want me to do? And they said, well, you know, sit on it for a while. We'll get some information. We'll talk to the Indian government. We'll come back to you and tell you what to do. Meanwhile, don't tell anybody you've told us. So I said, fine, no problem at all. And the upshot of it was, I got told, well, they'd like this consignment to be delivered, because that way they can find out who it's for, because it's obviously for a rebel group and they don't know who it is, so they want to follow it all through and then arrest everybody. And the chap who was organising this, the Danish businessman who was organising all this, bought himself an aircraft to ship these arms into India. And we reported all this back to the Indian government. You know, they had the registration number, absolutely everything about this aircraft. But he made a mess of his licensing. You know, aircraft are a bit like cars. You've got to have your insurance, you've got to have your MOT and stuff like that, you know. With an aircraft, you've got to have a certificate of airworthiness and things like that. And it must be issued by the country that operates the aircraft. And this man had bought the aircraft and had his temporary certificate of airworthiness, but he hadn't renewed it. And so he was stuck in Bulgaria with this aircraft, and he phoned me for help. And funnily enough, I had special branch officers sitting in my office at the time. We're talking about this deal. We thought it was all finished, and this chap came on the phone and said, look, I'm stuck in Bulgaria and I can't fly the guns to India. I need help getting the documents. And, on the loudspeaker, of course, the special branch guy's listening to this. So we agreed that I'd fly over and sort out the documents for him. And I did that. It was a few days before Christmas. And when we did that, he said, well, I'm sorry. He said, you know far too much about what my plans are. I want you to stay on the aircraft until the arms are delivered. And he guarantee you I'll pay all your expenses, first class ticket home, you'll be home for Christmas and all the rest of it. I thought, bloody hell. My biggest worry was not ending up in a jail cell or anything like this. I thought, my God, the Indian Air Force are probably going to shoot this plane down. And of course, they didn't shoot it down. in the end, the arms got delivered. The aircraft flew on to Thailand, and on the way back, it got arrested. And the guy who actually organised it managed to escape and disappear, vanish completely. And myself and the Russian crew were arrested, and nobody believed us for a long time. But finally, Tony Blair did manage to get me out of jail. So that was.
And how long were you incarcerated?
8 years altogether.
8 years.
Yes.
And can you tell us what it was like during that time?
I don't recommend it. It was a horrific experience, but on the other hand, it had a lot of good points about it as well. In retrospect, I don't have any particular regrets, which might sound a bit extraordinary, but one of the things I discovered, it's a legacy from the old imperial days in India, is that the language of the courts in India is English. It's an extraordinary thing. India's a nation of many, many languages. I mean, Hindi and Tamil are just two of the main languages, but every little state has its own languages. Yeah. So I occupied my time in jail writing petitions for people, and this was the extraordinary thing. I could not only speak English, but I could read and write English as well. So I was able to write petitions for people who could then go to the court, and the petition would be very simple. It would be to the magistrate saying, look, I was arrested 3 years ago on suspicion of theft. I've been in jail ever since. The maximum sentence, even if I'm guilty, is 6 months. Please release me. And the magistrate would read it, stamp it, and off they'd go. Yeah. So in a way, that sort of pretty much justified my existence in India for a while. It's one of the reasons I don't resent what happened to me. So, it's 6 to 1, half as the other. Very hard. I don't recommend it. If somebody, if you go on to India on holidays and somebody says to you, either pay the fine or go to jail, take my tip, pay the fine.
What were the conditions like in the prison?
The cells that I was kept in, the high security cells, and my Russian colleagues, if you can imagine a stable, because that's what it used to be, a single horse stable with a single horse courtyard immediately outside, an open drain running across it. That's it, and there was no furniture of any description. You sleep on the concrete floor. You eat with your hands, and that's it. Virtually no medical treatment of any description. It sounds awful, but it's not as bad as it looks, because the temperature on average would be in the summer around 40 degrees centigrade inside there. It was like being inside a concrete frying pan. 15-foot walls all the way around, and flat concrete surfaces. But the plus side of that is that you could take an article of clothing and wash it and lay it on the concrete, and the sun was so hot and brilliant that there'd be no bacteria or anything like that. It actually kept things pretty clean. So, yeah, it was very, very hard and very difficult.
Now, since your return to Scarborough, I know you've had an involvement with Scarborough Castle, and now you're here at Beiderbecke's Hotel. So, what have you been up to since you got back to England?
Well, one of the difficulties I had was that I caught TB when I was in jail. It very nearly killed me. It's a terrible disease, tuberculosis. You never really recover from it, because whilst the disease goes from your body, it scars your lungs. Yeah. And that area of the lung which is scarred never works again, you see. So I've only got about 50% of my lungs left. And when I arrived back in England, I dropped off all the computer screens and everything, you see, and I was a non-person, sort of like 1984 or something like that, And the DSS, as it was, I think, sent me for a medical examination because I just come back from foreign jails and things like that. And they issued a certificate that says that I wasn't fit to work under any circumstances till 2012. And so I went to see my own doctor, and he looked and he said, well, I think this is rubbish. He said, I think you're perfectly fit to work. And I thought that as well. And so I started looking around for work, and the only people who would take a chance and give me a job were English Heritage. And even they then insisted that I took all manner of additional medical things. But I thought it was the ideal job. I went to Pickering Castle at first, which is just outside Scarborough. And it was a sort of combination of fairly stressful physical work and a lot of paperwork and what have you. And I thought this is the very thing. If I do this for a few months, I can prove that this certificate from the DSS is wrong. I'm perfectly fit to work. Yeah. And, I really enjoyed serving the public. It was absolutely fascinating. That sort of business and the heritage business, and it'll be the same with National Trust, no doubt. Virtually everybody you see coming through the doors is on holiday. And your role is simply to make their holiday better. You either have a ruined castle or a ruined abbey, or if you're National Trust, you've got a beautiful country house and stuff like that. And the people are there of their own volition, and they want to know more about it. And, it's a most rewarding thing to be able to provide a high standard of customer service. And it was the first time in many, many years that I'd been involved in direct customer service to the public as a whole, en masse. And in the end, I went from Pickering Castle to Scarborough Castle, and then the opportunity to come to Beiderbecke's presented itself. And it's a lovely hotel. It's almost like working for English Heritage because we're in a Grade 2 listed building, which is an absolute nightmare. Where you can probably call the plumber. I have to call the plumber and an archaeologist. Or at least an architect, because it's the most beautiful, as you know, Regency Terrace here. And that's the reason we can't have double glazing along there and things like that. So it is, in a way, a little bit like still being in the heritage business. But I love it. And, Scarborough's a wonderful place.
It is.
It's fabulous to be able to welcome people here and to be able to contribute, hopefully, towards making their stay more rewarding and more relaxing. The more, this is a town that lives off tourism. Without tourism, we don't exist. So I think it's a pretty important thing that we do, and it's really great in the twilight of my working career to have an opportunity to contribute to that. It's almost turning a full circle, because that's how I began my working life in the restaurants here, and now many, many, many years later I find myself back in the hospitality industry and loving every minute of it. It really is fantastic.
Good. Well, thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to me today.
It's a great pleasure.
And I wish you every success for yourself and for Beiderbecke's in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. And I wish all success to Scarborough TV as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.